Penn State Wrestling heading undefeated, as expected, I would say, into the biggest duel of the season so far. Ohio State coming up this weekend. I'm Thomas Frank Carr, Penn State Wrestling reporter. Greg Pickel with me right now as we're breaking down that, but also quickly to start reviewing the duel against Maryland. Penn State, another decisive victory. So, Greg, first off, welcome to the show. Always appreciate you doing this. Did we learn anything about Penn State this past weekend?
Yeah, so a couple of things, Steve Frank. Good to be with you as always. So first is that there were a lot of people concerned in the Penn State wrestling community. I don't know if it's a lot of people, but a fair number, at least at the Blue-White Illustrated.com message boards and across social media, kind of wondering where the pins were at for this Penn State wrestling program. Obviously, over the years, it has become known for not just winning national titles and individual titles, but also running away with the team race some years at Big Tens and at NCAAs, in part because it racks up bonus points via pins. Throughout the first half of the season, Penn State was not necessarily pinning people and turning people as much as many are used to with the Cael Sanderson team. I think part of that is the 3-point takedown now and how quickly you can take a guy down, bring him back up, take him down again over and over, and all of a sudden a technical fall is in your favor before you can even get a turning combination together. You have Carter Starachi then maybe upset the Maryland bench a little bit when he worked for a pin instead of just taking the technical fall and going on his merry way at Maryland. But as you mentioned, the Terps, they put up much of a fight. It was 42-6. Penn State won 8 of 10 matches by bonus points, and they also netted 4 pins. So it was a good weekend for the Lions in College Park. Of course, much of the focus, T. Frank, as we'll talk about in a little bit, was related to who was not there for Penn State as it relates to the 149-pound weight class. But all told, Penn State goes down, gets its 51st straight consecutive dual meet victory. It will look to make that number 52 against Ohio State, which, of course, we'll talk about in a little bit as well. But, yeah, I think we learned that, anyone worried about, whether Cael Sanderson team's capable of racking up pins and scoring wins by bonus points need not to worry, which you should have already known, but I think you certainly know after last weekend.
Yeah. So something that I think has been a theme for, and I don't know if we talked about this on the last show, but something that's come up a couple of times, talking about the number of duels they've had and the back-to-backs on certain weekends, not as many of those. But just generally, I imagine the fiercest competition that these guys face is in their own wrestling room. So just based on kind of the way the season has gone, do you think that these guys are getting enough work to be prepared for those, what they really want to be and what Cael Sanderson is always talking about, even previewing this upcoming duel? It's not about this one. It's about championships and March. So do you think that they're getting enough, they're challenged enough, and that they're getting the work they need to improve so they're ready for that run late in the year?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This just came up at Cael Sanderson's news conference back on Tuesday ahead of the Ohio State match, and I thought he had a pretty good answer. It sounds like some guys, Starachi being one of them, and that may have led to his race for a pin on Sunday. He, of course, missed 2 dual meets earlier this year due to illness. One that has been kind of going through the team. Cael Sanderson making note of the fact that, your guys go home for winter break, they come back, one guy is sick, and it kind of just becomes a bit of a domino effect. I'm paraphrasing what he was saying, but that's what he was getting at. So, yeah, I do think they're kind of in the same place they are most years. Again, not as many dual meets early as is common for a Penn State team. Part of that with the Olympics team trials coming up and some things that are related to that. Senior nationals back earlier this year, the NWCA All-Star event with numerous Nittany Lions. It just didn't work out to have as many duels early, and then you can see guys miss duels because of illness here in January, and that's obviously led to some lower match counts for especially the stars than what we're used to. You saw the first coaches rankings come out recently, the weight by weight rankings, and a number of Penn State wrestlers were not in it because they did not have the number of matches needed to qualify for it. Just to be clear, you need 8 matches at a particular weight to qualify for one of the Big Ten NCAA allocated spots for the national tournament. So Penn State guys will get there. You don't need to worry about that. There's 5 dual meets to go. The ones that aren't there yet are on the cusp of getting there. So Penn State will be fine from that perspective. But there are some guys that, last year, I think we all saw what Roman Bravo Young did, and it was kind of a very strategic plan to not have to cut twice in multiple weekends, and he'd wrestle maybe the first match and then not the second one, or vice versa. He would show up a little bit over and then cut down the wrestle, and that's not necessarily what these guys in the upper weights are doing for Penn State. The ones that have missed matches, they just have been dealing with illnesses and off and on little blips that have kept them out of the lineup. So I don't think this is a this is frustrating them, I think is probably the simplest way to put it.
Yeah.
Are they going to end up peaking at the right time in March? Of course they are. It's a Cael Sanderson team. There's no question about it. But yeah, a little bit of a different plan for those guys this year compared to what we saw last year at times. And it just happens. I mean, and I think Cael Sanderson said it well. Every team in the country is dealing with this to some degree. It's just a matter of when it hits you, how quickly you catch it, and then how quickly you can make sure it doesn't get to other guys. And, when you're in a wrestling room and you're traveling in a plane to these matches, if you're on the road, it's a lot easier said than done. So I hope that sums things up. But by and large, Penn State's in a fine place. If you're quite, if the main takeaway of all this is simply that Penn State's in a fine place as the second half of the season rolls along here, that's really what the focus is, and they're gearing up for the postseason, which is, of course, now a month away.
So 149, I know part of the lineup, not just guys missing matches, but also some decisions to make. So 149, Tyler Kasak, David Evans. What's the situation there?
Yeah, so Cael Sanderson says that because they sent those two wrestlers to the Lock Haven Matt Town Open last weekend, they didn't bring them with them to Maryland. Connor Pierce stepped into the lineup and lost the match at that 149 pounds at Maryland. But the reason he was in the lineup is because Penn State sent David Evans and Tyler Kasak to the Lock Haven Open, where they both were able to get 4 matches in. And this goes back to the number 8, the magic number 8 I was talking about earlier. Yes, if you're sitting there saying, well, both of those guys wrestled at the Army Black Knight Invitational, they are obviously each got 2 dual meets in January. If they want to wrestle in the postseason at 149, which obviously one of them does because Bo Bartlett is slotted at 141, don't forget that David Evans and Tyler Kasak wrestled at the Army Black Knight Invitational in November at 141 pounds. So for the sake of seeding purposes and having enough matches to qualify for the NCAA's Big Ten pre-allocated spots, those matches mean absolutely nothing. So getting those guys 4 matches at the Lock Haven tournament, in addition to the 2 each of them already has, obviously, I'm not a mathematician, but that puts each at 6 at 149 pounds here in 2024. Right. That allows Penn State to say, okay, even though Tyler Kasak has now beat David Evans twice heads up this year, once at 141 pounds at Army tournament, and now again last weekend 4-2 at 149 pounds. I mean, I think from the outside looking in, you hear Cael Sanderson say, well, the fact they both have 6 matches gives us some flexibility. Obviously, with 5 dual meets to go, you're not super concerned about how you're going to get those guys to 8. They will get there. But, he says they don't have to necessarily make the decision this week. I just have a really hard time believing that they're not going to make that decision this week. And that when you go into a match against number 7 Ohio State and you have next Friday, number 2 Iowa on deck at their place, that you're not going to have the guy that you think is the one that can score you the most points at Big Tens and Nationals in those matches. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So I think that Cael Sanderson, like James Franklin, like I'm sure Mike Rhodes to some degree, a lot of things are posturing for the sake of keeping the internal until the opponent has to know what's going on. I just would be very surprised at this point if Kasak is not the guy for Penn State at 149 pounds. But as we sit here, whenever you're watching or listening to this edition before the match on Friday, if you happen to be listening to it afterwards, then we probably have an answer for you somewhere at bluewhiteillustrated.com. But going into that match, they are not intending to tip their hand on what they're going to do there. Again, I think the fact that Kasak has 2 head-to-head wins, Cael Sanderson called that an important part of the decision-making process, but he is not willing to give Tom Ryan and Ohio State any indication of what they're going to do Friday night. So that's where things stand there, T. Frank. I'm not sure how much of a mystery it is anymore, but it continues at least to some degree as we head into Friday night.
Yeah, this is obviously a recorded show. We recorded this earlier in the week, but it's out on Friday in the morning on the Blue-White Illustrated YouTube channel. So this is a bit of a pre-duel, pre-game show in a certain aspect. So let's talk about Ohio State coming up theoretically tonight. What are you expecting between these two teams?
Yeah, should be a entertaining match. I'm not sure, if you're not following wrestling closely or if you just haven't taken a look at the matchups yet, you might see number 1 versus number 7 and say to yourself, that could be a really competitive meet. And I mean, look, anything's possible, but in most cases, Penn State is going to be favored across the board in this match, as it is in almost every dual meet that it competes in. The highlight bout is without question going to come at 141 pounds, as long as everyone is happy, healthy, and ready to go. We're going to have Jesse Mendez, number 3, at 141 pounds from Ohio State, taking on number 2, Bo Bartlett, 141-pound senior, of course, from Arizona, longtime member of the Penn State Wrestling program. That's your highlight duel. The second one would come at 149 pounds in all likelihood, where number 9, I believe he is in the latest rankings. Yeah, number 9, Dylan D'Amelio. He is going to wrestle either Tyler Kasak or David Evans. So that'll be a good test for either one of those guys. And there are some top 10, top 12 matchups kind of up and down the board. But when you look at matches where Penn State could really legitimately be threatened, I think that really, obviously, 141 is a coin flip. I make 149, a toss-up, probably obviously lean towards Ohio State slightly there, but not by any great stretch of the imagination. And it's just hard to see where else Ohio State scores any points, period, let alone bonus points that would keep them in this match to potentially win it. So I would expect Penn State in front of a frenzied Rec Hall crowd to win its 52nd straight dual meet. But I still think there's a lot we can learn about this team from this match. You know, one of the hottest wrestlers in the country, or at least he was recognized by the Big Ten, I believe the NCAA, this past week was Nick Feldman. He's down up to number 12 PA native heavyweight. We'll see if he has anything for Greg Kirkliet, who has looked just fantastic at heavyweight for Penn State, number 1 in the country so far this season, despite missing one match. So, you know, that would be something fun to keep an eye on. I would not expect him, the Nittany Lion, to have any troubles. But, you know, we can keep learning about this team and what it can do to score points in different ways and rack up its team total, which, of course, again, it's an individual sport in a lot of ways, but it's also a team sport when you're talking about scoring at Big Tens and Nationals, and, of course, in these dual meets as well. So plenty for Penn State fans to keep an eye on, and this thing starts at 6:30 Friday night on Big Ten Network.
And last thing, just on the horizon, you mentioned Iowa. Always a massive showdown. You got get your binoculars out, look into the future, look out in the distance for us. What do you see? Just a general overview of that.
Yeah, I mean, you look ahead to that match. Obviously, it's going to be out in Iowa City. The Hawkeyes lineup impacted by the, I guess, ongoing investigation into, gambling related to student athletes out at Iowa and at Iowa State. I know that some news came out on that front that seemingly would have favored those student athletes, but I can't promise you, as I sit here right now, that any of those guys that were not on the mat will be on the mat or vice versa. I would doubt it at this stage, but you never know how these things shake out. But all told, it's another very good Iowa team. There's no question about that. There's going to be a fantastic matchup at 125 between Drake Ayala and Braden Davis. Real Woods, the Iowa standout at 141, is going to, of course, face Bo Bartlett. And those two are obviously plenty familiar with each other. As the standings sit right now, you'll have a 1-2 matchup between Levi Haynes and Iowa's Jarrett Franek at 157. So, again, this should come as no surprise, but up and down the lineup, Mikey Caliendo and Mitchell Messenbrink at 165 will be a tremendous match. And, again, it's just, you still make Penn State the favorite going into any of these matches. I mean, they've won, as we sit here going into the Ohio State match, Penn State has won 51 in a row. So You can't really, it's hard to call them an underdog unless you know somebody's sick, hurt, whatever. This is a lineup that is poised to score points and win these kind of matches, as they've done for a long time in the James Franklin era. But it's fun when you see Ohio State coming to Rec Hall, and you know what that means for both of those programs. And then you see Penn State turns around a week later and goes out to Iowa City, and obviously the environment there will be electric in Iowa City. So fun dual meets coming up, T. Frank, for Penn State. Again, I'd make my favorite in both. And I think what the most important thing is that regardless, and Cael Sanderson says this all the time, of how the wins or how the losses happen, it's what you can learn about these Penn State wrestlers to project for the postseason that's often most interesting. And so that's what we're watching for here and telling you all about, and at bluewhiteillustrated.com as well.
Yeah, so if you want to check out more, Greg, bluewhiteillustrated.com, as he mentioned, and for any of our YouTube and podcast listeners, if you're listening to this right now, you can subscribe for just $1 and get 2 months of access. That's code PSU1, Blue White Illustrated, so you can get in on all the inside information on wrestling, basketball, football, recruiting, and more. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. He's Greg Pickel. Enjoy the weekend. We'll be back next week to recap Ohio State and look forward to that big matchup we just talked about with